Hey, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, SPC-209. It is I, Vic McInnes, live on tape from my COVID-19 compound here in Grovetown, Georgia, the Aiken Outpost in Columbia County. Wanting you to know that today our message is brought to you by your pants. If you've been inside for 3 or 4 weeks and you want to go outside and check the mail, make sure you wear your pants. Okay, so today we're rolling up on the end of the semester. Next week we'll be doing finals. I'll have more details for you through a Blackboard announcement here in the next couple of days. I'm supposed to meet with the department later on today via Zoom. Hopefully the Chinese or the Russians won't break in on it, and we'll get it all done. And I'll be coming out with when you're going to take the test. It'll be done on Blackboard. I don't have a whole lot of details at this point. I know we're getting to the end of the week, but hopefully I'll have something out in the next 24 hours. You're going to have plenty of time to do it. It's not going to be a problem, so everybody just relax and we'll take care of it over time. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to review for the final. 37 years ago when we started this semester, we started with Chapter 1. We basically marched all the way through it. We skipped Chapter 11. We took Chapter 12. We took 9 and 11 together. So we're going to be reviewing the semester. I have my lecture notes here. And what I do, even if we were in the classroom, I would just go over the things that I will be drawing test questions from. I haven't written the test yet. I write the test new every semester. I use some of the same questions. I update a bunch of questions. I get rid of a bunch of questions. But I will be writing the test probably over the weekend. These are going to be the high points that I'm going to be looking at that you should be aware of. Now, I'm not going to go over these things in depth. What I've done is that every semester I go through my lecture notes and identify, yep, that's important. We should probably ask a question about that. Yep, that's important. Could ask a question about that. Now, I probably identify enough for 150 questions easy. There's going to be 40 questions on the test. So all of these are not going to be on the test, but these are things you need to sort of focus on and concepts you need to understand as we head into the final next week. Okay, so let's get started with Chapter 1. We looked at the definition of communication. Be familiar with that. We talked about the human communication process and the key components. Now again, this is on tape. This will be loaded to YouTube. Feel free to hit pause at any point in time. Feel free to go back. I'm going to be going over this really fast, so feel free to stop at any point in time. Okay, so the human communication process has 4 components, the participants, of which there have to be at least 2 or more, a message, a channel, and feedback. Okay, 4 components. We define interpersonal communication as between 2 people whose lives are mutually influenced by each other. Okay. We talked about group communication, we talk about public communication, we talk about mass communication. Those are the 4 forms of human communication. Interpersonal, group communication, public communication, and mass communication. We looked at a bunch of models of communication. Those slides are loaded onto the document section of the Blackboard page. Go back and look at those, okay? If I really tell you you need to look at something, I can guarantee you there's going to be a question. I love questions on the communications models. So be ready for that, okay? One of the things we talked about early on is why we communicate to meet physical needs, instrumental needs. We talked about communication competence, okay? And for communication competence, we talked about knowledge, ability, and context, okay? Let's go to Chapter 2. Chapter 2. Chapter 2 was communication and perception. The first thing we did was we talked about perception. We defined it as the process of selecting, organizing, and interpreting our experiences. We talked about all of those individually. Selection, organizing, interpreting. We talked about how we perceive others. We talked about attribution, primary effect, recency effect, and other factors like culture and personality. Okay, we talked about perceiving and presenting ourselves. We talked about improving perception of some obstacles that can cause that. Okay? Flying through this stuff. Flying through because we're up to Chapter 3. Chapter 3 was about language. And we talked about right off the bat that language is symbolic. Excuse me. I don't have the COVID, but I do have allergies And you can literally see the pollen blowing off the pine trees here in Columbia County. So I'm going to be drinking a lot because things are happening in my sinuses and in my throat we don't want to talk about. Okay. We talked about the language is symbolic. We talked about the triangle of meaning. Very important. We talked about different meanings. We talked about the denotative and the connotative meaning. I would be aware of those. We talked about the rules that govern language, and we talked about the definition of grammar. We talked about figurative language like simile and metaphors. We talked about speaking ethically, which included ends justify the means, situational ethics, and credibility-centered ethics. Okay? Chapter 4. Okay, nonverbal communication. We came up with an informal definition of nonverbal communication, which is everything that isn't the words involved. It involves all the other senses. Okay, some things to note that nonverbal can be very important in conveying emotional content. Nonverbal communication is more ambiguous. We believe nonverbal communication more than verbal. Nonverbal conveys meanings by reinforcing the verbal message. Nonverbal communication is more convincing than the verbal message in often cases. And nonverbal cases can be used to regulate conversations. Like, stop, I need to say something now. Okay? We talked about the types of nonverbal communication. Okay? And that really is all I'm interested in Chapter 4. Let's go to Chapter 5. Listening. Chapter 5. Okay, listening. We talked about the difference between hearing and listening. Okay? Know the differences between hearing and listening. Then we talked about the Blaine-Goss listening model. Blaine-Goss listening model. Can you see that? Blaine-Goss listening model. You should be familiar with that. You should have seen that before. If you're not familiar with it, please go to the document section. I've loaded that image up. There will be questions on Blaine-Goss. Okay, we talked about the stages of listening, that we're receiving, understanding or interpreting, and remembering and recalling. Then we talked about listening style. People-focused, action-focused, content-focused, and time-focused. Okay, we talked about impediments to listening, like noise, physical noise, psychological noise, physiological noise, semantic noise, differences between speech and thought rate, selective attention, and then receiver biases. Chapter 6. Interpersonal communications process. Again, we noted that, hey, we're almost halfway through the class. Time we should start talking about the subject. We talked about why we communicate with other people. Talked about like define the relationship talk. So, are we friends now? So communication helps people define relationships. You use it to gain compliance. You use it to achieve a relationship goal. There are self-presentation goals as well. Okay. Chapter 6 got us deep into conflict. Conflict is inevitable in relationships, and conflict and anger should not be perceived as a negative all the time. So there is multiple conflict management styles. Hold on a second, I'm turning the volume down here. So in case something's about to pop up and start making noise on my computer. Okay, so we talked about conflict management styles: competing, avoiding, accommodating, compromising, and collaborating. Okay. Then we talked about negotiations. All right. We talked about the steps of negotiation. There were 5 of them. Be aware of the steps of negotiations. Okay. And then we talked about why we self-disclose in relationships. Okay. We do it for 2 reasons: social penetration and social comparison. Chapter 7. Communication in relationships. Okay. Why do we form relationships? And then we identified 3 reasons: the need for inclusion, the need for control, and the need for affection. Okay, we talked about the stages of relationships. They were on table 7.1 in the book. Listen, if I tell you to go back and look at the book, okay, and to look at a table on 7, and I mention it here and I mention it in the lecture, yeah, and then you're surprised when it's on the exam. Okay. All right, we talked about social exchange theory. Okay. Be aware of social exchange theory. We talked about friendships. We talked about the 3 types of friendships: reciprocal, associative, and receptive. We talked about why we become friends, proximity, reciprocity, and then there are several more. We talk about friendships across our lives, like adolescence, early adulthood, later in life. We talked about families as a communications group. Okay. Be up on those. And then we talked about anger. We also talked about relationships at work. Go back and review those notes. And then we talked about anger. And we said that although anger is neither good or bad, violence is never appropriate, including verbal violence. And we talked about a whole lot of how communicative aggression, including degradation, physical or emotional withdrawal, restricting another person's actions, domination, or threatening physical harm are all unacceptable. Okay, then we hit chapter 8, culture and communication. Lemonade. Okay, culture and communication. We started out, talked about these 6 layers of culture. Be familiar with those. I already know one question I'm going to write for that. Culture is how we develop a sense of who we are, our identity, even if our sole goal is to reject the dominant culture that we were raised in. That rejection defines our identity. We do have multiple identities. We have a personal identity, a social identity, and a cultural identity. Be aware of all of those. Then we talked about some specific cultural identities like race, gender, sexuality. Go back over those notes. And then we talked about intercultural communication and how cultural communications can be very ill-defined. So it's very easy to, and they are constantly shifting. So it's very easy to make a mistake. And we talked about ethnocentrism. Okay? Then we talked about cultural appropriation. Go back and look at the notes on cultural appropriation. We're up to chapter 9 and chapter 11. Okay, chapter 9 was public speaking. We talked about the 3 things to be considered when you're going to give a public speech. Speaker, occasion, the audience. We talked about audience analysis, the ways to do it, demographic, psychographic, situational, and again, remember situational means the situation that you'll be speaking in. Okay, like the size of the audience and things like that. Purpose-oriented. Okay. Then we talked about some sources of data. Then we talked about the 3 general purposes of a speech. All speeches should have one of 3 general purposes as their primary general purpose: to entertain, to inform, and to persuade. You can have more than one of those, but one has to be primary. It has to be primary, or it won't be an effective speech. Then we talked about how you drill down and find your specific purpose. Then we talked about how to organize your main points, and we went through a whole series of these: chronological, narrative order, topic order, spatial pattern, causal pattern, problem solution, and then we talked about the motivated sequence. I love the motivated sequence. Okay. Then we talked about, in chapter 11, we talked about, again, public speaking. We really focused on, we talked a little bit about informative speaking. You have to choose an audience that will engage and educate. It's got to do both. It can't do one or the other. And then we talked about persuasive speaking. And then we talked about how Aristotle said there were 3 ways to persuade: pathos, logos, and ethos. Be aware of those 3. Okay? The most common and the go-to organization for a persuasive speech is problem solution. Remember, the problem has to have 2 parts: a cause and an effect. Oftentimes we do an effect and cause because that gets people's attention, but problem has to have cause and effect. The solution has to have practicality and efficacy. Practicality is, can we do it? And the efficacy is, will it solve the problem or at least help remediate the problem? Okay? Then we talked about reasoning. We talked about inductive reasoning, one-to-many. We talked about reasoning by analogy, which is one-to-one. Then we talked about deductive reasoning, which is reasoning from the many and applying those ideas to one person. Okay? We talked about fallacies like the hasty generalization, the false analogy, false authorities, arguments ad hominem, and an appeal to tradition. Okay. Then we talked about cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance. Okay, it's chapter 10, and this will be the last one I will be showing fingers for because I just ran out. Okay. Chapter 10 was about performance apprehension. It really started off that way. We talked about, the experience in the stages of performance apprehension. The stages of performance apprehension graphic is on the documents page of the Blackboard. Go look at it because I love asking questions about performance apprehension. Okay, causes are biological, previous experience, and level of skills. We talked about some ways to deal with it. Then we got into methods of presentation, and they were reading from a manuscript, speaking from memory, impromptu speaking, and extemporaneous speaking. Okay? We talked about nonverbal delivery, and we defined nonverbal as pretty much everything that didn't involve, verbal. Okay? And I think that's about it. Chapter 13, we skipped chapter 12. Chapter 13, small groups. Know the characteristics of a small group. How many people can you have in a small group? How many people? Why do you have to have a minimum size or maximum size? Remember, we talked about the structure of a small group, and it's the structure is influenced by the internal and external issues. And those are clearly, we talked about those. We talked about the size is a significant issue, as well as communication pathways that were available. Other characteristics that would be important would be the interdependence of the group and the shared identity of the group. Small group functions, we talked about those, and those would include to meet instrumental purposes, to serve interpersonal needs, and to meet identity needs. Okay? And then there are advantages for the individual and for the organization to work in small group, and I ran down 6 different advantages to the organization. Then we went over to the phases of small group: forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning. Okay? You will see questions on that. I love phases of small group development. And then we talked about some problems you may confront: groupthink, conflict. And again, remember, just like earlier, conflict is not inherently bad, as long as it doesn't become aggressive or violent. Okay, chapter 14, leadership. We define leaders and leadership. We talked about how leaders are chosen. We talked about leadership styles. There are thousands of leadership styles. Again, it's in the book. Read the book for this part of chapter 14. We talked about leadership and power. We talked about task roles. We talked about the 3 types of roles that a group member can take: task, maintenance, and disruptive or individual agenda roles. We gave examples of all of those. Okay. We talked about group problem solving. Okay. Problems have 3 common components. Talked about that. We talked about steps to problem solution, and there was 5 steps. Then we talked about leadership functions, and then we had this as a continuum of leadership functions. I'm going to try to hold it up there for you to see. Okay? All right? From consensus to voting to compromise to authority rule. Okay? All right, that scoots us over to chapter 15 and 16, media, technology, and interpersonal communication. Okay, I went through the 8 phases of mass communication. Be aware of those. We talked about the functions of media. We talked about the importance of the gatekeeper. Know what a gatekeeper is. Then we talked about how there was a massive shift in the nature of mass communication in the early 2000s with the beginning of streaming and the ability of the consumer to reach in and pull media and not have to wait for someone to push it to them. Then we talked about the impact it has on our relationships and our interpersonal communication. We talked about dormant networks, and we talked about branding. Okay, and then we also talked about self-disclosure as being a core function of a friendship is now easier than ever before in history. Okay, all right, that is it. 19 minutes and 5 seconds. I know I took about 2 minutes up front just yammering. Okay, but here's what I need you guys to do. There will be 40 questions on the test. I've set up the points. I don't remember off the top of my head because I've been doing nothing but final reviews all day long. So here's what I would tell you. Just be aware of all the stuff we covered, and there's no trick questions. I'm going to advise you to read the questions thoroughly before you get started because there are some. All of these except. Okay, and it's going to be loaded on Blackboard, and it's going to be graded by Blackboard. I'm not going to see the test once you take it. All right? Okay. So this has been kind of a tremendously bizarre semester. Usually I like bumping into some of the people and seeing you guys at the SPC-209 final. I'm not going to have an opportunity to do that. I will extend to you but you're still my students. Even though in this semester that has been at least 56 years long, I'm not going to have a chance to interact with you personally. I still, I feel, have the obligations that an instructor has to any class. So I was your communications instructor. I am the lead instructor for speech at Aiken Technical College. I am open to you guys if at any time in the future you want to come, assuming we ever get back on campus. We will get back on campus. When we get back on campus, or if you want to shoot me an email, you guys have got my email. Just drop me a note and say, hey, listen, I have this issue I'd like to come talk to you about concerning your professional life. Personal, but then I probably know somebody. If you're having problems with communication in your personal life, I know some people that we can get you in contact with. I will tell you guys that even though we haven't met, I've read all your discussion boards, so it's really kind of online classes are really kind of weird for me because you guys really, some of y'all do really, really well in opening up on those discussion boards, so it's kind of weird to think that I know you. And occasionally I will see people in the hall that will just run up and say, hey, Mr. McInnes, I was in your SPC-209 class last semester, and I have no idea who they are. But when they tell me their names, I can remember a lot of the stuff they talked about. So it's kind of an interesting sort of dynamic. But what I'm going to tell you guys right now is we're in some very weird times. I haven't been out of my house with the exception of, I think, 2 runs to the grocery store and running to Farmhouse Burgers to get burgers once a week because we're trying to do what we can to keep that economy going. But what I will tell you this is many times when I've been given an opportunity to speak, they wind up saying, calling me, because of the places I've worked and the people I've worked with, they wind up using the word hero when it comes to me, and I always, first thing I say is, I'm not a hero, but I've known many heroes. I've had the great privilege to work with many heroes. Well, always that had to deal with, soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen, and Coast Guardsmen. Now I'm going to open that definition up to make sure that I know many of you out there working in the healthcare field, you're working at the local hospitals, you're working at the local care centers. A lot of you guys are first responders. You work for the fire department. You work for, EMS. And a lot of you guys are doing an incredibly vital job by working at the local retail outlets that have got to stay open. You're working at the local restaurants. You're just doing what you can that on all these essential tasks that only make minimum wage. And I hope at some point in time, you guys right now, you're my heroes. Because all I have to do is sit in this office and have my bookshelves behind me and occasionally talk and upload stuff to YouTube. But some of you guys are going out every day and getting it done. And I always defined a hero as being someone who gets it done even though there's personal risks to themselves. Well, you guys meet that criteria hands down. What I am going to tell you is, for those of y'all who are home, who were suddenly taking on roles like educating your children like you never thought you were going to have to, taking care of elderly parents or grandparents that you never thought you were going to have to, running errands at risk to yourselves whenever you go outside the house. You guys are doing great work and should be applauded for it. And I hope that someday we will acknowledge the important work that you guys have done through this crisis, and that we figure out some way to reward you in a means that lets you live in a style of life that your dedication to your jobs has shown over the last couple of months. So anyway, that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. The only thing I have left to say is good luck, Godspeed, stay safe, and stay well. I will be back on campus one day. Feel free to stop by and say hello. Office 756, you're always welcome.